friends, Lynette here, and today we will be making a 15th century kirtle. My inspiration for this dress came from period imagery. I cannot begin to tell you how many countless hours I've spent digging through museum websites and pinning images and checking sources. The 15th century kirtles that I want to make are commonly front-laced. Those side-laced kirtles were a thing. The kirtles can be made to be fully supportive, but I prefer mine fitted without being a supportive garment itself. If you have a more curvy figure, you may find fitting this garment to you a little challenging. People have done it, and I praise their skills, but I am not one of them. So I found a friend I'm very comfortable with, and she fit me for a bodice mock-up. The skirts on this dress start at the natural waist, so the mock-up itself really doesn't have to be very long, as the skirts are going to be easy to just draft with a straight edge or a chalk line. To make one of these kirtles, I'll typically use between 3 to 5 yards of fabric, depending on how full I want the skirt and if there is a waist seam or not. For this project, I'm going to be using 4 yards of green linen and some cotton to line the bodice and extra lining around where the laces will be so it doesn't crinkle up. So to start with, this is part of the bodice mock-up. Here's the front. You can see the curve to allow the bust. I did have to pin that just to stop the gaping in the armhole. It's not very long because the skirts come right off the natural waist. There's the front and the back. And the back. Now I have them marked exactly what they are, and there is no seam allowance, so we'll have to draft a seam allowance. I'm gonna hand flat fell this because I like the way it looks, so I'm gonna be adding about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So after looking at my green linen, I overestimated how much of it I had. Not enough purple either. I have several yards of this earthy olive color that I actually rather like. So I pinned my pattern on, and using a seam gauge and my trusty chalk pen, I added my seam allowance. The skirt can be drafted using a straight edge or a chalk line. The gores are also made using a straight edge. I know how long they need to be, and then I mark the center of the fabric. The front gore is cut on the fold, and it won't have a seam running down the middle. However, the rest of them are half triangles, and since they will have to be sewn together, there will be a seam. This is an efficient way to cut gores and save fabric rather than just cut a bunch of full triangles out. The sleeves are S-shaped with the seam in the back, and they're rather short. They'll taper a bit, but I don't want my sleeves too tight. I did cut some cotton lining for the sleeves since the 1460s, 1470s imagery I saw shows pinned on sleeves, and I wanted to support the linen a little bit. I started with pinning the gores together since we'll be needing them shortly. I'll be flat felling all of the seams on this dress, which means that I need to cut one side of the seam allowance and fold the other side under, so it can be whip stitched down. I can always tell if I've been sewing too long because I get the most adorable interruption. More hand sewing. I find this much easier to do if my work is laid out on my lap or pinned to itself. After I finished hand sewing, I sewn the back and inserted one of the gores, making sure that this gore had a seam down the middle. Once I have the back sewn, I'll pin and sew the 2 side gores onto the main body piece. I chose to sew them onto the back piece, but you can sew them on the front if you prefer. I stitched the shoulder seams together, then marked where my natural waist is, and started pinning the sides together. Now that all the gores are sewn together, I need to fold all of the raw edges and practically fill this thing with pins. I pick a side to be the short side and sew that down. Then I pin down the long seam running from the top of the garment to the hem. This will cover the raw edge of the short seam. So what you aren't seeing is my multiple attempts to pin the sleeves on right, but after much finagling, I finally got them, and I will be flat filing them as well. So halfway into making this, I decided I didn't want to line the top completely, but I had already cut out my pieces. I still needed to line the edge of the top because of the eyelets, so I took my seam gauge and my pen and started salvaging the end of the bodice pieces. I cut the fabric 2.5 inches wide with 1/2 inch to fold over, but it could be narrower since it's just there to help with the eyelets. The edge of the lining strip is going to have to be clipped so it'll lay flat. The sleeve and the neckline are folded over twice and stitched down. I find the hems easier to do if I lay the dress out flat, so I can make sure it's even. Once it's pinned, it can be sewn down, but don't be me and sew the whole thing on a hardwood floor. Time to do the eyelets! I'm using a heat erasable pen to mark where my eyelets will go and spacing them by 1/2 inch. The kirtle is going to be spiral laced, which matches up to most of the imagery I found, and it's also easier to do yourself in my opinion. To make the lacing spiral, the bottom and top eyelets are going to match up, and the rest will be offset, so that when you thread the lacing, it does go in a spiral pattern. here's my take on a 15th century kirtle. It's really comfortable and I really love the linen. I absolutely adore the way it looks in the sunlight. I'm also pleased that I didn't line it since it's in the mid 80s today and it's still technically spring. In the summertime down here, it gets 110 easy and I'll be outside at events, hopefully. So I've got a very long list of projects to do and I do want to film most of them, but I think for my next video, I'm going to make some headwear for this outfit. As you can see, I've got some very nice non-medieval hair here, so I need to cover that up. Women would have covered their hair in that time period anyway, so it's win-win. So I definitely think a medieval hood is going to be my next video. I hope you found this video helpful and at least somewhat entertaining. Thank you so much for watching.